Well, throughout the years, there are two countries that we can be assured will be of interest to our members and other audience members at the World Affairs Council. And those countries are China and Russia. Last week, as many of you know, we talked about China and China's trade with the United States, and tonight we're going to talk about Russia. We should have an intriguing discussion tonight on political and economic developments in Russia and the role of President Putin in shaping the past 8 years in that dynamic country. The very popular President Putin will soon end his term, and he has handpicked his successor. But the question is he really going to go away? What is Russia's future? And will current domestic and foreign policies continue under Russia's new leadership? Let me introduce our distinguished panel. Their biographies are in your program, so I'm not going to go over their entire resumes, but I just want to introduce them briefly. First, my colleague from the Political Science Department at Grand Valley State University, Dr. Heather Taffel, who will act as moderator tonight. Next, we have Dr. Gerard Liberian, who holds the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of Michigan and is a former advisor to the President of Armenia. We expect Dr. Liberian brings an interesting perspective to this discussion, as Dr. Liberian in the center. And closest to me is Dr. Jim Butterfield of the Political Science Department at Western Michigan University. He's a longtime friend and member of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. So let me tell you a little bit about our format tonight. First, Drs. Butterfield and Liberian, in that order, will each speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then they will respond to each other's remarks. We'll then open the discussion to your questions, and Dr. Taffel will help moderate that question and answer period. Okay, so without further ado, let me turn the mic over to Dr. Butterfield.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for inviting me this evening. It's an organization I have a lot of respect and admiration for. It's also always nice to come back to the Aquinas campus and these great facilities here. Before I start my remarks, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I've started tonight's slides with a caricature of Putin. There is no law against publishing political cartoons featuring Putin in Russia, but there is an unwritten rule, and media outlets of all types have engaged in self-censorship of any submissions of caricature, satire, or even normal criticism. So I figured I could put one up without retribution, and I will. Reason magazine claims that Putin is accelerating a return to Sovietization and the Cold War. Senator and presidential candidate John McCain claims that Putin is trying to restore the old Russian Empire. An article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung warns that Putin perhaps represents a return to the Soviet Empire. A Ukrainian newspaper asks, will Vladimir Putin become Vladimir the Terrible? Okay, testing. Okay, is it close enough to me? Testing. 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 How is this now? Sounds like we're getting a little feedback too. Testing. Testing. Can you hear me in the back? I can probably do, oh, how's that? Suddenly I can hear myself very well. Is that better? Okay. Not sure what happened, but we'll go with it. Okay, a little higher yet? Thank you. Okay, how are we now? Good. Let's hope we can keep it that way. Even the political cartoonists have raised the specter of Putin raising the Soviet phoenix from the ashes, or worse, casting himself in the image of one of history's most brutal dictators, the man who more than anyone else built the Soviet system, Joseph Stalin. Indeed, reminiscent of Nero's fiddling, we sometimes stand accused of engaging in the adventure of toppling Saddam Hussein's statue, while Putin busies himself with resurrecting Stalinism. Is there substance to such concerns? Clearly, Putin has largely dispensed with the institutions of democracy and engineered a way for him to stay a power, and perhaps even the power, for the foreseeable future. But has his endgame been to reconstitute the empire and to re-engage the U.S. in a Cold War? I don't think so. Instead, I believe Putin has dedicated himself to strengthening Russia, and especially the Russian state, after the tribulations of the transition of the 1990s, in part so that it can return to being a major player in international politics. This is partially an endgame in and of itself, but it's also a means to position Russia and the people who run it to be major players in the business of business. Today's Russia does not seek to become the Soviet Union again, it seeks to become Russia Incorporated. Now, when I say that Putin is not the new Stalin, I don't wish to whitewash anything the Kremlin has done, or in many cases stands accused of. I underscore stands accused of because many high-profile events remain unsolved, or if officially solved, leave many doubters as to the authenticity of the resolution. Whether it's the 2006 assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya, the successful poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London that same year, or the near-successful poisoning of Viktor Yushchenko in Kiev in 2004, the 2003 death of investigative reporter Yuri Shkochkin due to a, quote, severe allergic reaction, or the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings, many doubt the Kremlin's protestations of innocence. Yet such tactics, if indeed the Kremlin is involved, and I'm persuaded that in some cases it is, are tools of trade of many dictatorships. But while I think it's clear that democracy is being dismantled, and there's much solid evidence beyond the high-profile crimes that it is, it's not clear that the reason for doing so is to reestablish the Soviet Empire or to re-engage the U.S. in a Cold War. The Russian leadership is probably too smart for the former and is certainly too smart for the latter. Let's start with the first part of the argument, that one important element of Putin's legacy is his dismantling of the institutions of democracy. Consider, he has reasserted state power over most of the broadcast and print media, either directly or through companies close to the Kremlin. He engineered a reform of the process for selecting the governors of Russia's provinces. They were directly elected before, but now are appointed by the president. Since the governors make up the Federation Council, which is the upper house of parliament, this not only guarantees Putin's authority in the provinces, but helps ensure a pliant parliament. He led the effort to pass new laws on political parties and elections. The accompanying regulations require parties to demonstrate a presence throughout the country, require increased numbers of signatures to get on the ballot, and raise the threshold for parties to get into the Duma from 5 to 7%. More recently, a new law was passed restricting the activities of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. This has been largely seen as a mechanism to undermine those NGOs that have a political agenda, be it supporting competitive elections or advocating for civil liberties. And of course, these measures all reinforce one another. And they serve one other important purpose, to avoid any surprises during elections. In the Duma elections held just 2 months ago, while 14 parties successfully registered, only 4 surpassed the 7% threshold to gain seats. One of them, United Russia, which is the party that Putin himself joined weeks before the election, gained 70% of the seats. The charade continued. Putin, who must step down as president at the end of his second term next month, announced 1 week after the Duma election that his preferred choice to be successor was 42-year-old First Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. A lawyer by trade, Medvedev has served in a variety of posts but has never held elective office. His principal qualification, in addition to being an intelligent and talented administrator, is his loyalty to Putin. 2 days later, Medvedev ended speculation about how Putin would maintain a dominant role in Russian politics by indicating Putin would be his prime minister should he get elected. And given that polls indicate he has between 70 and 80% of the electorate behind him, that election is assured. Well, concurrent with the steady retraction of democratic institutions, Putin has worked to reassert Russian power and influence in numerous ways. Close to home, Russia has continued to meddle in the affairs of the former Soviet republics, especially Georgia, just south of its border in the Caucasus. 3 ongoing separatist conflicts are abetted by the presence of Russian troops, ostensibly for peacekeeping purposes, but almost certainly to keep the Georgian leadership off balance. Russia has also been a major force in the new great game a reference to the 19th century competition between Britain and the Russian Empire over control of Central Asia. And by the way, Russia won that time around. At stake this time are enormous hydrocarbon fuel deposits. Russia itself is a major producer of hydrocarbon fuels. It has the world's largest proven reserves of natural gas and is its second largest exporter of oil. Turkmenistan probably has the fourth largest reserves of natural gas in the world, and Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan have huge reserves that are only just being exploited. What makes this game particularly interesting is that the oil and gas is all located very far away from markets. 4 of the 5 countries I've mentioned are landlocked, and Uzbekistan has the distinction of being the only double landlocked country in the world. So the solution, build a pipeline, or several pipelines. One can quickly see why the area surrounding the Caspian Sea basin has been euphemistically dubbed Pipelinistan in some quarters. This is a slightly outdated map of the existing pipeline infrastructure in the region, slightly outdated because hundreds of miles of new pipeline are being built every year. Red designates oil pipelines, while green designates natural gas. Despite the construction boom currently underway, this is still not significantly more developed than the Soviet-era infrastructure, and therein lies the problem. Many more reserves have been discovered in the interim. The existing infrastructure is insufficient, so new pipelines must be added. And of course, the $100,000 question is where? Options are limited. One of the most logical is to link up with Russia's existing pipeline infrastructure and beef it up, represented by number 1 on the map. This is logical for reasons of geographic proximity and the simplest route to European markets. But oil and gas are strategic commodities, and the US does not want Russian hands controlling the spigot. China has invested much diplomacy and money into developing exit routes to the east, number 2 on the map. A new oil pipeline is under construction in Kazakhstan, and a Turkmen-Chinese deal will see a new gas pipeline constructed by 2009. Route 3 through Afghanistan and Pakistan is not viable for obvious reasons. Route 4 through Iran is more unpalatable to the United States than the Russian route. Therefore, it's not surprising that we have invested much in pursuing pipelines through the Caucasus, number 5, culminating in the completion of the 1,100-mile Baku-Ceyhan pipeline in 2006. Russia is well positioned to compete for export routes of hydrocarbon fuels, and indeed, their actions, they would argue, in foreign policy in the region can be explained by our own actions. We have advocated the expansion of NATO, an organization that Russia considers to have outlived its Cold War rationale, into former Soviet territory with the addition of the 3 Baltic states. We have courted Georgia extensively. At one point a few years ago, Georgia was the largest per capita recipient of American foreign aid in the world. And Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili has not been shy in showing favoritism to the US or in expressing hopes for entry into NATO. Even schizophrenic Ukraine has in times indicated interest in NATO and EU membership, depending on whether it's the Ukrainian western half or the Russified eastern half that's talking. The Russian view, the Putin view, is that the former Soviet Union is in its sphere of influence, much in the way that Central and South America are ostensibly in ours. It's realpolitik all over again, but this time the competition is not over ideology, but influence. And influence is the key to business. As Dmitry Trenin of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace has argued, geopolitics is important primarily as it affects economic interests, not as a guiding theory. But wait, you might say. Russia has been willing to use its existing control over hydrocarbon fuels as a foreign policy weapon. And the observant among you will notice that I've used yet another opportunity to put a caricature of Putin up. Witness the ongoing disputes between Russia and Ukraine over gas exports. The world, and especially Europe, woke up to the issue on New Year's Day 2006, when Russia stopped the flow of gas into Ukrainian pipelines and a dispute over price. The problem for the Europeans was that much of the gas that flows through Ukrainian pipelines bypasses Ukraine entirely and proceeds to European markets. The dispute was settled quickly, but was it a mere price dispute? Or was Russia miffed at President Yushchenko for its more Western-oriented policies than his predecessors? The beauty for Russia is the dispute served both purposes simultaneously. On the one hand, at the time, Ukraine was paying only about 20% of the world market price for natural gas, so a price increase could not be considered unreasonable. At the same time, the dispute and Russia's willingness to turn off the tap in the dead of winter underscored for Ukraine and anyone else that was paying attention that Russia is well aware of the world economy's dependency on hydrocarbon fuels. As if to further the point, a year later, it did almost the same thing to Belarus and Armenia, both allies. Allies perhaps, but in the eyes of the Russian leadership, business trumps all. What does this all demonstrate? First and foremost, Russia is quickly regaining the confidence it lost in the 1990s. This is something I think we can safely credit to Putin. Second, it also demonstrates that Russia is skilled at playing the game of business. This is evidenced not only by oil and gas exports, but by the expansion of Russian firms into foreign markets. Perhaps you've gassed up during a family vacation at one of the more than 2,000 Lukoil gas stations nationwide. Lukoil is Russia's largest private oil company. Sieverstal, another private company, purchased Rouge Steel several years ago in Detroit, at that time the 5th largest steel company in the United States. Russian aluminum, metallurgical, gas, oil, and nuclear businesses are all interested in the United States. I focus the latter part of remarks on Russia's policy towards its neighbors for two reasons. First, if there's going to be an attempt to resuscitate the empire, it will happen here. It will happen there. Clearly, Russia wants influence, but there's no evidence yet that it seeks to reincorporate parts of the former Soviet Union back into Russia. Second, its behavior there illustrates its behavior elsewhere in the world. Russian leaders, I think, have a very clear worldview. All democracies have serious flaws. All political leaders lie to their people. No country has unlimited freedom. All governments, including and especially the United States, exist largely to serve the interest of their respective corporate sectors. Why, they argue, should Russia be any different? It does not see its relationship with the U.S. as antagonistic, but it does see it as intensely competitive. They seek to pipe Central Asian gas and oil through Russia. We seek to pipe it through the Caucasus and Turkey. We seek to control oil exports from the Persian Gulf. They seek to support Iran as a counterweight in the region to our presence in Iraq. They want to enter the World Trade Organization. We want expanded access to Russian markets for agricultural commodities, industrial goods, and services. In international relations, Russia is a bargainer. If we want cooperation on Iran and North Korea, for example, it will have to come as a price. The price would likely be tacit agreement to keep NATO membership at its current level and discontinue efforts to woo Ukraine, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, not to mention seizing attempts to place a missile shield system in Eastern Europe. In this, Putin's two largest legacies are synergistic. He has strengthened the Russian state in part by dismantling democracy. Critics, I among them, would argue that in the long term, the absence of a free press and a meaningful opposition will likely lead to greater inefficiencies and ineffectiveness as corruption increases without the counterbalances of transparency and accountability. Clearly, Putin does not agree. A stronger state better serves Russia Incorporated and is better able to compete on its behalf in the rough and tumble world of international politics, a point he underscored just last week in his final press conference as president. Thank you.
Much of my commentary will touch upon the following issue. How do we decide what questions to ask with regard to Putin and Russia? To what extent the questions we ask predetermine the outcome, that is, the answers we give? In principle, there are four angles we can use to look at Putin and Russia. One is from within Russia. One is from the immediate neighbor's point of view. The third is, in general, the international community. The fourth, very specifically, the United States. Usually, although we may start by posing the questions in the first three categories, it is the fourth, that is, what is it to us? How will we look when we answer these questions? It is that question that determines, in fact, what do we do with the first three? And that leads to certain distortions. Asking the question Putin's shadow and Russia after Putin predetermines already that Putin determined Russia, when in fact Russian history shows that there are so many factors that determine as to who can end up being a leader in Russia and what a leader can do. Those are far bigger than any single individual. There's so much in Russia's political culture, its collective memory, it's the interaction between its collective memory and current problems, so many factors that determine as to what kind of man could have come to power after Yeltsin. And if you remember, Yeltsin went through, I don't know, 3, 4 prime ministers until he found the right one. So it wasn't that there was Putin who was there waiting to rise as the leader of Russia, but they were experimenting, they were testing, and Putin turned out to be the right man at the right time. The other comment I'd like to make before going into specific angles of discussion is that we have to realize that other countries in the international community, and every single country, however small, however insignificant for us, every country has the capacity and the right to determine for themselves what is their national interest, regardless as to what we think about that. This is fundamental because we tend to think that if we've determined our interests, the other countries must fall in line, and they are good only when they align their interests with ours and they define their interests in terms of what we think is good for us and for the world. This is a very fundamental problem in US foreign policy, which has consequences as to what, as was indicated, as to how Russia reacts to what we do. I can mention that when I was working in Armenia for the president there from 91 to 97, when US ambassadors came to talk to the president, they wanted to lecture him. They would not accept counter-arguments. They could not accept that a president of a small country could have equal arguments and the capacity to determine what is right for that country. And often we determine support or non-support for other leaders in terms of as to whether they fall within the strategy we design for them. And this is quite important in terms of understanding Russia then and Russia today. If we look at Russia from the inside, there are a number of points to be made. One is that there seems to be a cycle historically in Russia whereby if you see democracy, but if you have democracy, there seems to be chaos that accompanies it. And when you see order, order comes at the expense of democracy. Now, whether this is altogether true or not, there seems to be a certain pattern. And in Russia today, we have seen movement from the chaotic but exhilarating years of the early 90s to the orderly world of today, moving in some sense in the direction of China. That is, moving toward a one-party system, but not totalitarian. Economic reforms, economic freedoms are there, and there's even printed press. China is not there yet, it will get there. That is free in Russia, but not television, because printed press is expensive. People get their news usually from television, and that's what you need to control. Now, the chaos of the early 90s, as I said, was exhilarating in terms of the kinds of parties that evolved and directions, debates, discussions on the future, and the various institutional changes that were taking place, but they were also chaotic, and they were, to some extent, they were dangerous. There is, for example, in still 95, in 1 week, we had in Armenia, dealing with the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijan, 3 different emissaries from Moscow with 3 different strategies and messages. One was from the foreign ministry, one was from the military, and one was from the president's office. In the same week, 3 different, and this is extremely dangerous because they start competing with each other, and then it is always small nations that suffer when there is chaos in the big ones. And you could want nothing more than a person like Evgeny Primakov, who became prime minister in January of '96, and he put all of that in order. Then there was peace. Then you could see, even if you didn't like the policy, you could work and on the policy, for the policy, against the policy, but at least you understood what it was. I think the current situation, as was described, Jim, I agree with him, I think totally with regard to where things are. There will always be a modicum of appearances of a democratic state, because for Russia, doing business also means being accepted, and being accepted is having a minimal requirements fulfilled in terms of democratic credentials. Here too, though, we have a problem. When we raise the question of democracy, there are 2 problems. One is, we have used, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, we have used the model, or the term transition. That is, they were there, and there's an ideal place where they're going to go. And we've been using that terminology, the paradigm of transition and transitioning and going backward a little bit and forward a little bit. My view is that they have transited already, if you'll allow me the word. They've done it already. This is it. For the foreseeable future, this is going to be it, and it's just not Russia. You look at Georgia, you look at Azerbaijan, you look at Armenia, you look at Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan already, that's another story. But it is a process, it is a work in the making, and there may not be any more progress for the next decade or 2. There may be a backward slide in some of these republics, Russia included. They will do it as long as necessary to create a state that functions, and a state that had the experience of a Chechnya. We cannot underestimate the importance of Chechnya in the making of Russia today. That is, Russia goes to war in '94 and is defeated in 2 years by a small nation of less than 1 million people. The superpower. And going back in '99, Putin's first major act was an inevitable step, but one that required quite a bit of cruelty, dislocation, the killing of civilians, and the damage and the deportations and every other thing you can imagine in the case of a war, but there was no way they were going to let Chechnya go. And once that becomes a method of resolving problems, then you can see that the democratic issues we raise are really quite secondary. That the country's territorial integrity is reinstated, and then the rest of it, whether a political columnist is killed or not, it's not that big a thing as far as many Russians are concerned. The second point with regard to democracy is that when we raise that question with regard to Russia, and we go in such details in the courses we teach, in the articles we write, and our candidates talk about it, I don't know why Senator McCain or the other senators, the candidates, are not talking about Saudi Arabia. How much of a democracy is there in Saudi Arabia? It's much worse than Iran. But we don't talk about it. Our candidates don't talk about it. So what does that say about what we say about Russia? What does that say about the question we raise about Russia? It feels like the reason why, or at least one consequence, if not the reason why. We raise the question of democracy, and we go through in detail talking about the lack of democracy or the backward steps in Russia, is that it makes us feel comfortable disregarding the legitimate interests Russia has in its foreign policy. Makes us feel okay to say that Russia is bad, it's not democratic, therefore we can go to its backyard in the Caucasus, push Georgia toward NATO, put in a pipeline that bypasses Russia, work toward the isolation of Russia, which was an expressed policy goal, as Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot testified in Congress, to make sure Russia doesn't have any influence and to isolate Iran. That was the purpose, political, strategic purpose at least, of that pipeline from Azerbaijan through Georgia, then down to Turkey to the Mediterranean. We expanded NATO, despite the promise we made that we wouldn't when Germany was reunited. We continued NATO. We put bases in Central Asia. We do all of that. We think it's all legitimate in our national interest. Well, does Russia have any legitimate national interest? Is it okay for Russians to feel that they're being surrounded? Well, we want to feel it's okay. And one of the ways we do it is by raising the question of the democratic credentials. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Let me go over the specific region Jim mentioned, South Caucasus, and look at Russia, test whether there's an imperial ambition there or not. Is there a desire to re-establish influence? Absolutely. Is this a defensive or an offensive policy? That is was Russia going to do that and do it the way it is doing no matter what? Or did we do certain things, or these countries did certain things? When the Soviet Union collapsed, in 2 of the 3 republics of the South Caucasus, the presidents who were popularly elected were extremely anti-Russian, to the point of presenting a danger to Russia. That's Azerbaijan and Georgia. Subsequently, by 93, both presidents were overthrown, and more moderate, pragmatic presidents came. Things quieted down a little bit. However, we decided, that is the United States and to some extent Europe, that we are going to go into each one of these republics, and working both on the pipeline as well as on strategic other issues, we determined that we should do whatever we can to, again, have Russia decreased influence. We thought Turkey might do this for us in these republics, but Turkey could not do it, so we decided to go directly to these republics, and Georgia became a donee, Armenia was receiving money, Azerbaijan eventually started getting help. But we find that this is important for our policy with regard to Russia and Iran. And yet, Russia has serious interests in the south. The south of Russia, northern Caucasus, has a series of autonomous republics that are Muslim and that are vulnerable to fundamentalist movements, and Chechnya was openly up in arms against Russia. And what Georgia and Azerbaijan do matter to Russia in terms of its southern border and southern security and its territorial integrity and the ability of neighbors to foment trouble. Now, the South Caucasus is interesting because it has 3 republics with very different relations with Russia. It was mentioned that Georgia has the most difficult problem, and when you ask Georgian leaders and say, why can't you find some way to get along with Russia, they say, well, we don't know what Russia wants. But Russia has made it very clear what it does not want. It does not want NATO, as was mentioned already. But we push for it, and at some point, some Washington officials even mentioned that it might be very possible for Georgia to become a member of NATO. On the other hand, recently, though, I think there's been a decision that Georgia is off the list, which may calm things down a little bit. But Azerbaijan has had a much better relationship with Russia, although it has more complex issues to resolve with Russia, such as the rivalry. They're both exporters now of oil, and Azerbaijan will become an exporter of natural gas as well. There are a number of other issues between them, but for some reason, Russia has not put the kind of pressure on Azerbaijan that it has on Georgia. And partly, it may be explained by the actions of the Georgians themselves. So it becomes difficult to say, is Russia's attempt to infiltrate? They've taken over the energy grids, and they may take more, but it's all legal. Just as our companies want to take over oil companies in Iraq. It's not that different. But I agree that this is not a matter of recreating imperialism. I think, at least at this stage, what Putin was trying to do was what Lenin did. You retrench in order to strengthen. You strengthen, and then you see what power can be used for. And at this point, I think there is a systemic approach to the succession in order to guarantee that the institutions remain homogeneous. I'm not saying they're very solid in Russia, but they're homogeneous because they need to consolidate their position within and then start coming out gradually and see where they can extend their influence. Thank you.
And now we'll just hear from our panelists in response to their comments.
Well, Dr. Liberian and I did not compare notes prior to our presentation this evening, and I don't know if the council was hoping for a nice heated intellectual debate, but if so, we're going to disappoint you. Or we have disappointed you. There's very little that I find to object to, in fact nothing, in what you've just heard. So I'll follow up with just a few more points. In part taking off on what you've just heard, first of all, my own personal note, in the middle of the 1990s, while Gerard was working in Armenia, I was involved in some foreign assistance projects funded by USAID in Russia, and I was also struck by, despite the fact that these were collaborative teams put together, the messages that were sent down very clearly were to largely ignore the Russians' input. There was very condescending attitudes and this constant lecturing. We were involved at that time in agricultural privatization projects of various types and rejuvenating social services in the countryside, and it was really quite distressing to the Russians. And there were a few Russian-speaking people in these projects. I was one of them, so I could share the conversations with the Russians and share conversations with the Americans, and they were just coming from two different planets on these issues. And not surprisingly, a good number of those projects led to very little. A second observation, Dr. Liberian brought up the issue of collective memory and sort of Putin matching the times, and I think there is indeed something to that. I would say, based on my just personal experiences over 2 decades in talking with Russians and reading their media and books, that they're probably more acutely aware of their history and the weight of history than we typically are. And they certainly associate times of weakness historically with opportunistic attempts to take advantage of their weakness. As a matter of fact, the 1990s was popularly called in the press as the third time of troubles. The first time, of course, was at the time of preceding the Romanov accession to the monarchy at the beginning of what was that, 17th century. There's a reason I'm not a historian, it's because I can't remember dates. One of many reasons. The second was the interregnum between the two revolutions in 1917, and the third was the period roughly coinciding with the Yeltsin years that this moniker of time of troubles came. I will say this, though, political culture shapes futures. It does not determine them, though. And I will say this, I think Putin really matched both the political culture and history, collective memory of Russia and the times. Anytime we in political science pay a lot of attention to institutions, and anytime institutions are weak, personality matters that much more. Institutions often shape actions and constrain actions, and when institutions are in flux like they were in the 1990s, that gives personalities like Yeltsin, before he became largely incoherent, and like Putin, the opportunity to make major decisions shaping the future of the country. And to that degree, I think Putin has played his role very well. I want to say just a couple more things. How much credit do we give Putin for what's happened since 2000? I want to ask two related questions. That's the first one. And in anticipation that this might come, I prepared a couple of graphs for you. I don't know if you can read all the detail here, but it's not important if you can't. Those are three different lines. One of them represents economic growth rates, one of them represents industrial production, and one of them represents agricultural production. And you can see there's a lot of volatility in that graph, but you see it's mostly low at the beginning and mostly high at the end. Now, when did Putin become involved? Right there. You can see that the upswing in economic growth, industrial production, and agricultural production was already underway after that trough, which is represented by the 1998 financial collapse. Let's look at a couple other figures. The decline in inflation. 1992, Russia experienced 2,600% inflation, 2,500% inflation. That's what that spike is at the beginning. When did Putin become involved? Right there. The issue of inflation was largely settled. Despite that, he took credit for that in his press conference last week, as any smart political leader would. The third graph here is the Russian stock market. If we had been brilliant back at the beginning of the decade, we would have invested heavily in the Russian stock market. For those of you that did so, I congratulate you. I don't know why you're here instead of down in Florida someplace. When did Putin take over? Right about there. Now, certainly most of the growth this is the RTS index, most of the growth has taken place since he came to power. But you can see the upswing once again started there from roughly the financial collapse. That's also about the same time after the financial collapse that the massive capital flight that took place in the 1990s stopped, and more reinvestment started taking place. Now, second question. So that was the first question. How much can Putin take responsibility for in terms of recovery of the economy? My response, the response of many others, including a recent Foreign Affairs article by Michael McFaul and Catherine Stoner-Weiss, is that, well, how can I put this? It's him taking credit for the economic recovery is sort of like the rooster taking credit for the sun coming up. An old observation that I'm rehashing in yet another way. Second question. Okay, we've already patterned for you how he is dismantling the institutions of democracy, attacking the free press, violating, in some cases, civil liberties. Why is he so popular? 70–80% popularity rates. 70–80% popularity rates. He's in a position to say, I want Dmitry Medvedev to become the next president, and immediately Medvedev has 70 or 80% popularity rates. How can we explain that? Well, very simply, I'm going to crudely simplify this because I only have a moment. Let's consider the 1990s. 1992, 2,500% inflation. 1993, a dispute between the parliament and the presidency resulted in tanks firing on the White House, the so-called White House, which was the seat of parliament at the time. Middle of the second part, let's say the second part of the 1990s, a president that was largely absent without leave, including the very embarrassing moment when on a tarmac at an airport in Shannon, Ireland, at a refueling stop, while the Prime Minister of Ireland and various school kids and bands and so on were waiting to have a very ceremonial greeting with Yeltsin, he was unable to descend the steps because he was in a drunken stupor. 1998, an enormous financial collapse. Issuing of currency, lopping 3 zeros off the currency. So instead of buying bread for several 100,000 rubles, you could buy it for something that was a little bit less embarrassing. Now let's look at this decade. Industrial production is up, economic growth is up, inflation is down, the middle class is growing, the country is not falling apart. Only one separatist conflict remains, that's the one in Chechnya that Gerard already mentioned. Look, Russian voters are probably not a lot more sophisticated or less sophisticated than American voters. When somebody comes and asks, how do you approve of Putin's job in office, or do you think Putin should continue to play an important role in politics after his term is over? They don't say, let me consult the last 10 years of economic data and I'll get back to you. It's very impressionistic, and the impression is life was really tough in the 1990s. Public opinion polls in the 1990s, when the population was asked, what do you fear the most, frequently cited civil war at the top of the list, civil war. civil war or crime in the streets or any number of things like this. In this decade, it's much more likely to be something much more benign. So people have this very simple correlation and a logical correlation between the chaos of the 1990s and the prosperity of this decade. And Putin has been extraordinarily lucky in one other way, and that is in 1998, the price of a barrel of oil was $10. Remember that? And I don't need to tell you what it was just a few weeks ago. So it's been an enormous windfall. Revenues flowing into Russia, which has enabled Putin to invest in infrastructure. They've paid off almost all foreign debt. They have a $150 billion stabilization fund, enormous foreign reserves, about $500 billion in foreign reserves. Clearly Putin has not only suited his time, but he's also been extraordinarily lucky.
Okay, so it seems that we have quite a bit of agreement. So I think we'll open it up then to questions from the audience. So I guess we wanted then people to come down to ask the questions. And I just guess I'll start off with sort of the first question. I don't know if you've been following the news as of the last 2 days, but the former territory of Serbia, Kosovo, has declared independence. The American president has recognized that that's something that the U.S. supports. Russia is not particularly pleased, and so I'd like to ask our panelists what they think that this sort of disagreement over Kosovo, how that might affect then U.S.-Russian relations.
Do I need a mic from you, or am I okay? Okay. A couple of points with regard to Kosovo. When the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia collapsed, there was a general agreement in the international community, and this is one of the important agreements that brought Russia and the West together, was that there would be recognition of the independence only at the level of the constituent republics of these two federations, not autonomous regions within these. Soviet Union had 15, so there'd be 15 republics, regardless of what other issues there might have been. And that's why, let's say, in Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, in Azerbaijan, Karabakh, and Transnistrian, Moldova, that these, and possibly hundreds of others, and Chechnya, could not attain independence, because as the Europeans and Washington used to say, once you go that route of going down, that is applying the principle of self-determination below the level of constituent republics, then you're going to end up with 2,000 states on the Eurasian continent. And that's why many governments felt comfortable using force against secessionists. But there was the principle that no matter what, however harsh the treatment of the central authorities, these territories would not be given independence. And this was a unifying theme in the early 90s. And that's how it went down to the present. Today, the United States and some European countries are making an exception to Kosovo. This is great for the Kosovars, but it spells disaster for conflict resolution in the rest of the Eurasian continent. It will be impossible now to convince the Abkhaz that they deserve anything less than full independence. The argument has been that Kosovo is different. Well, it isn't different. They're all the same. There was forced use on Abkhazia, there was forced use by Azerbaijan on Karabakh, there were deportations, there were bombings, and violence was the method to resolve these conflicts. Then it was stopped. However, it was stopped. So at this point, I think, although it is good for the Kosovars, I can see that for Russia, this will become a very, very important weapon, and they will play it to the end and create more problems for Georgia. I know that the Georgian president, Saakashvili, when he was here, and the Azerbaijani president, they begged the US government not to support Kosovar independence. because they said, after that, how are we going to deal with our problems? But for some reason, we're going ahead with it, and I think it's going to be a very, very long-term wound in the relations, as well as making the resolution of these conflicts, other conflicts, more difficult.
Thank you very much. Several months ago, Gary Kasparov was making the rounds in the United States on various NPR media outlets regarding the situation in Russia and the difficulties he had in forming a political party and running for president. And I understand recently he abandoned his run for president because of I'm not sure the details, but something about not getting enough signatures and things like that. I just wonder, are his criticisms valid, and does he have any particular prospects as a potential rival to Putin and the Putin United Russia Party?
Answers to your question are yes and no. Kasparov's a very interesting character. He's absolutely right. I mean, here's what happened to him. He was all set to become the nominee of one of the they call them liberal parties there, but pro-business, pro-kind of human rights parties. And nobody, and according to the law, you have to become presidential candidate, you have to be nominated in a convention. And nobody in the city of Moscow would rent them a hall where they could hold a convention. So by virtue of the fact that they couldn't hold a convention, he could not be nominated. That's how the game is played these days. A former Prime Minister, Kasyanov, who was also planning on running in opposition. Now, he was originally appointed by Putin to be Prime Minister. They had a falling out. He was fired. He sort of went over to the other side, was also going to run as an opposition candidate. He assembled the necessary amount of signatures, and about 20% of them were ruled invalid, and therefore his candidacy was rejected. What's interesting about both these cases is that probably even in a fair election they would stand no chance. Even if they had access to media, they would probably stand no chance. The liberals in Russia, and by liberals again I mean something different than we mean here. It's again the pro-business kind of center right. Are very closely associated with the policies of shock therapy and the rapid inflation of the 1990s and so on. And I think even in a free and fair election, they probably wouldn't stand a chance, whether it's Kasparov or Kasyanov or Nemtsov or someone else. And yet, there's this issue. This is kind of a curiosity to me. Putin seems to be so concerned about opposition, and he seems to take it personally when he is opposed, especially by somebody that might have some credibility as a candidate, that the authorities really, really attack these people. Kasparov was to hold a rally 5 days before the Duma elections. This would have been late November. They couldn't get permission to hold the rally. They held it anyway. Policemen showed up with clubs. And Kasparov was detained for several days in jail without being charged. Kasyanov has not only been rejected as a presidential candidate because his signatures have been ruled invalid, he's now under a criminal investigation for deliberately forging those signatures, which is almost certainly, well, I'm sure, absolutely certain as a signature. It's a fiction. So several parties were allowed to run in the Duma elections, and there are 3 opponents to Medvedev in the presidential elections. They are the Communist Party candidate. The Communist Party has consistently lost support in the past several elections. An unknown candidate, largely unknown candidate, and the comic relief candidate, Zhirinovsky, who also has proven time and time again he can get 10 or 15% of the vote maximum. So for purposes of the show effect, there are opposition candidates, but I see no chance for them forming parties or gaining any serious in the next, as Jared says, next 10 to 20 years. I see very little change on the horizon. It's a good question.
I want to ask a question about Russian public opinion. I know that much of the good feeling that the Russians have about Putin is based on economic prosperity, but I also understand that Putin's put together quite a bit of Russian nationalism and, bringing Russia's pride back and so forth. To what extent is that about Russia taking pride in its economic prosperity in recent years, and And to what extent is it potentially rooted in resentment that you both referred to about American dominance and American unilateralism? How much is the public opinion resentful of American leadership, or if at all?
I think it's both. They're not mutually exclusive by any means. Putin does get credit for the economy. He also gets credit for restoring stability and order, which he deserves credit for that, and keeping the country from falling apart. But certainly he has used the symbolism of the reemergence of Russia as a great power, and been willing to demonize the United States in order to help support that position. And that's not unique to Russia. I have to say that in the last 5 years, taking a position in opposition to the United States almost anywhere in the world increases one's popularity both in domestic politics and in foreign affairs.
May I just add one point, and tying it to the previous question with regard to Garry Kasparov. He's, anytime a Russian politician tries to become something with American help, by using American media or getting support from the United States officials, it is a minus in the minds of most Russians. They're seen then as foreign implants that they cannot manage on their own democracy, their own authoritarian government, whatever. This is seen not proper for a country with the civilization that Russia has, with the history that Russia has. And this becomes a negative point. While we think we are supporting someone good and we're doing something good, over there, for the most part, it will be seen as interference in their affairs and pushing issues that will weaken Russia. So there's something substantive in what is felt. It's not just a PR issue.
Does the attitude of American foreign policy, does it seem to be continuous through Clinton, George W. Bush? I mean, did it start with Clinton? Did it start with Bush 1? I'm trying to understand if there's any continuity regardless of administration.
I think it started with Clinton. It was very confused at first. But with the Clinton years, you could see a lot of the arrogance. You could see a lot of the actions that Russians would consider anti-Russian. But also the Clinton years were somewhat different in the sense that they did not go against international treaties as the Bush administration did. So Bush, the Bush presidency continued many of the policies, the basic policies. The pipelines and the other issues were Clinton year issues. But Bush took it a step further with the abrogation of the ABM treaty and a number of other international understandings, and not pushing for the ratification of some other treaties that had been negotiated. So much more unilateral. Clinton was able to hide much better than Bush. The duality that, yeah, we're friends, but we're going to do what we want to do.
May I follow up on that just for a moment? I would argue that there's been at least 5 distinct periods since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which means that we have to think about 2 Clinton periods and 2 Bush periods and 1 Bush senior period. One of the remarkable stories that was fortunately never a story was the fact that, if you notice, that there's been no accidental nuclear explosions, there's been no widespread theft of nuclear material, there's been no wholesale exodus of ex-Soviet scientists, nuclear scientists, to quote-unquote rogue states. That is because the elder Butt, what's happening? Are you getting this feedback, or is it just me?
No, it's there.
Okay, well. The senior Bush, there we go. And the early Yeltsin administration cooperated on, first of all, getting nuclear weapons out of the 3 countries that had them, other than Russia, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and cooperated on controlling the nuclear fissile material, and in paying scientists a decent wage so they would not likely leave the country. In fact, the nuclear proliferation that has taken place in the last decade has not been because of ex-Soviet scientists, it's been because of our quote-unquote friends in Pakistan. So that's sort of the first Bush, of course that was very late in the Bush presidency. Early in the Clinton presidency, there was a cooperative arrangement set up between Prime Minister Chernomyrdin and Vice President Gore as a talk shop to try to coordinate policies. And there was, I think, some substance to that. But by the second administration, this arrogance crept in that Gerard is talking about. One good example of that was at the time when we started the shelling of Serbia. I'm not sure when this would have been, about 96 or so, if I'm not mistaken, 98, I'm just really not sure. There was a four-nation party that was meeting in France to talk over these issues, and Russia was part of that, and we were undergoing the pretense that Russia was a partner in those discussions. In fact, we started bombing Serbia without even telling the Russians, sort of showing them what we really thought of their input at that moment. And it might have been possible to negotiate and use sanctions or use Russia's diplomatic channels. It might not have been, but we never gave it a chance. I would say in the first Bush administration, the attitude was a little bit different. The Bush administration, I think the first Bush administration, this is Bush Jr., had a tacit agreement with Putin. Remember, he met him in, what was it, Kennebunkport, and he said, I looked into his eyes and saw his soul, something he does not like to be reminded of right now. I don't know what soul he saw. I guess he didn't identify what soul he saw. But they had a tacit agreement. As long as there would be cooperation in the war on terror, the American administration would not pay attention to what was happening in Russia and the decline of democratic institutions. It was only a few years ago, with the issuing of a report from a bipartisan commission criticizing the Bush administration for turning a blind eye to the decline in democracy, that we started making some commentary about that. In Chechnya as well. The problem is that we have really lost some moral standing in international politics, and when we begin to lecture Russia on democracy, it just doesn't resonate, and you know all the things that have happened, the absence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and Abu Ghraib and so on and so forth, and these things will get continually thrown up to us, and they showed up in the press conference with Putin that I mentioned just last week, and it makes it very difficult for us to take a moral position on these issues.
Good evening. I think it was interesting when you brought up the acute Russian memory and historical character. Certainly Russian, imperial ambitions predate Russia itself. I mean, you look at the idea of Muscovite ideology, Moscow is the third Rome and such. And I wonder when we talk about, how much of that is transferring over, memory that. I mean, when Russia wants to become Russia Inc. rather than, reimposing the old Russian Empire, I'm curious, how much would you say that that's due to Putin, and how much would you say perhaps that's due to changes in the international political economy or combination thereof? If that makes sense.
Is that mine or yours?
Take it.
Mine, okay.
Thanks.
How much of that is due to Putin? It's due to Putin, and it's due to a lot of people that support Putin, and by this I don't mean the average Muscovites and Peterburgers and people in the provinces. I mean the power structure that supports Putin, because they all have their fingers in the pie, and they've all figured out that I think that the world economy operates much differently than it did 50 years ago, and certainly much different than it did 100 years ago before the Soviet Union. The globalization is the name of the game. The corporate power is what brings profits. And what's very interesting, if you look at much of the senior leadership of the Putin administration, you find some extraordinary things. You find Medvedev, the first deputy prime minister, now the president-designate, was the chairman of the board of Gazprom, the gas monopoly. Other senior members of the administration also hold similar positions as CEOs of both state and private sector enterprises. Now just imagine if a member of the Bush or Clinton cabinet simultaneously served as a member of the board of directors of Exxon. You may argue we don't need that the oil industry has enough influence in Washington without that. but that's not the point. There is a clear division between the private sector and the public sector, and that does not exist in Russia. So this emphasis on Russia Inc., I think that let's use this term, is a clear recognition by the powers that be that they can use their positions and their access to these new businesses, both state and private sector, to simultaneously enhance Russian power and Russian influence and egregiously line their own pockets.
I have a question about the future of Russia here a little bit, but real quick, just to add something that you finished up on. It almost seems like what you're describing with this possible use of flowing significant financial resources in the private sector as well, that it seems like they've essentially done the same thing that the Soviet command economy did, in that the command economy, the Politburo and the Soviet officials had control of these industries, and granted they weren't getting profit out of it, but they used the assets from that to better their own lives, and they were also in charge of the political situation. So I think that's kind of an ongoing trend that we're seeing. But to get to my question, I was going to go back to what you were saying earlier about Yeltsin being a product of his times and generation, as well as Putin then being a product of his. And I'm wondering how much we are going to see, and what do you think is going to happen with this president, the president designate basically for Putin, if he is going to, is he going to basically follow in the footsteps of Putin in that he's going to do something different from his predecessor, or is he going to just continue doing exactly, basically following the path that Putin has laid down and trying to bring the state more under central control?
That's a follow-up to your question, to your comment.
Let me comment on your first comment first. I still think there's a significant difference between Soviet-era bureaucratic control of major sectors of industry and what's happening now. This is capitalism, and what that means is, in addition to, it's corrupt capitalism, it's crony capitalism, but what that means is in addition to the corruption, it means that there's a lot of investment being poured into Russian industry. A lot of these companies are public companies or partially public companies. For example, Gazprom is 49% publicly owned. It's been floated on the London Stock Exchange. So that means there are shareholders. Those shareholders have some influence. The corporations have to be competitive in the international economy, which is a whole different ballgame than the Soviet era. So I think there are some important differences despite the continuity that you point out. Your question was about, what was your question about? Oh, Medvedev. What do I expect out of him? Acknowledging that I don't have a crystal ball. He was selected to continue Putin's policies. He turned around within 2 days and indicated he was going to appoint Putin as prime minister. That suggests that everybody's end game, at least in the near future, is continuity. Now, I can imagine a couple of scenarios here. Putin has already hinted at some point that maybe he'll serve as prime minister and then he'll run for president again in 2012. The term limits there are understood as being consecutive but not lifetime. So he could conceivably do that. He might alter, he and United Russia, 70% of the Duma, might alter the rules of the game such that it becomes a prime ministerial system ascendant instead of the president. A lot of countries have presidents and prime ministers, and it's prime ministers that really run the government. The presidents are more symbolic. He might shift the institutional balance of power. Or he may treat Medvedev, I don't know how many of you read the Time magazine piece on Putin as man of the year, but there was a joke in it. In case you didn't read it, I'll tell it to you. Putin and Medvedev reportedly go into a restaurant. The waiter comes up, the Putin orders steak. The waiter says, "What about the vegetable?" And Putin says, "The vegetable will have steak too." It's a popular joke circulating in Russia these days. And, you know, how much is there to that? It's kind of hard for me to predict. It's not inconceivable that 2 years, 3 years from now, Medvedev will get a big head. He's president, and he and Putin can have a parting of the ways. But gosh, I would at this point, as I indicated to you before, institutions are weak, which means personalities play a big role, and personalities are hard to predict.
May I just add one idea? Putin may not be Putin in 4 years. People change. If something is working, he tried to resolve some problems, institutional, state, he resolved them, and all of that required a certain system. And Putin may decide to go more liberal or even more autocratic later. So Putinism may be out of date in 4 years. It may be that that's what was needed now, but not necessarily in 5, 10 years. So the predicting is a very nasty business at this point.
Thank you very much.
This question is very future-looking as well. There's obviously a very shifting dynamic in the foreign relations between the U.S. and Russia. Considering the U.S.'s status in the world economy and Russian influence over oil, as well as the issues that Russia also seems to share with Muslim extremism, how important do you think it is for the U.S. in the future, in future administrations, to court cooperation and even allegiances with the Russian government?
Well, I wouldn't use those terms, but that there has to be cooperation, there's no doubt. There's not much room given the issues you raised, fundamentalism, oil, energy. But I'll take oil or energy. I mean, there seems to be a race now that will involve US, China, India, Europe for the oil that is needed. And there's a question as to whether there's enough oil around for all of us, particularly for India, China, that are growing at phenomenal rates. And just not the economy, but also the consumption of oil. How are we going to resolve this as an international community? Are we going to go backstabbing, stealing each other's sources, talk to Chavez a little more carefully? I don't know. But are we going in a conflictual method to resolve this? Or will there be an awakening that you just can't do it that way? And in this, Russian, US, European cooperation and China will be necessary. I may be dreaming, but I know the other way is extremely dangerous. And as far as fundamentalism is concerned, the Russian presence is, I mean, the Russian factor is important because, as I said, there's a huge series of autonomous republics. Then there's Central Asia, where they do have a permanent presence, as opposed to ours, where we may go in and come out. Russia will have limited but still consistent influence on Middle Eastern countries because it does not proclaim to promote democratic values and insist upon them in their relations with other countries. That's why others feel more comfortable with Russia than with us. And that's one reason, anyway. That is, they don't preach democracy when they're talking to Saudi Arabia, right? And the Saudi Arabians don't feel uncomfortable talking to the Russians. Well, they do talking to us, even if we don't raise the question with them. So the Russian factor will remain important. It will not be the superpower. It will not have the, let's say, the influence in Africa that it used to have. But it will have influence, and that is extremely valuable in terms of any need for cooperation in the future on these various issues you raise.
Thank you.
I think we have time just for these 2 more questions, one at each mic, okay?
I'd like your comment on the wisdom of us, of the United States, putting a missile defense system in Eastern Europe border, in the borderline countries of Russia, and the validity of if we actually need to do that, or whatever your comments are regarding proposed anti-missile defense system.
I have to confess, I don't understand the logic of it. First of all, I'm not aware of any successful test yet that has proven that the technology can work. I assume eventually it will, but as I recall, every attempted test that we've had has failed with our missiles falling in the ocean and not hitting intended targets. So that's one point. Second point is, it seems to me designed to be one of 2 things. One is to be deliberately antagonistic for no clear reason, or 2 is to start the process and then try to bargain it away for something else. That would be the most logical reason for doing it, but it's still not clear to me what that would entail.
And to me, you can see why Russia, but from here talking, why Russia would say, why are you doing that?
Well, I suppose if they put missile defense system in Mexico, we would have the same reaction.
What I hear a lot is you're talking about oil and energy. As far as what Russia is doing, it seems that the answer is pretty clear. Don't worry about oil anymore. Just change the source of energy, which seems to be in the news a lot lately. And I guess, I don't know if that's a question or not. But the other question I have is that in our desire to spread democracy all over the world, people aren't exactly taking our view of democracy the same way we do. So is the definition of democracy being changed? That's it.
I'll give you a quick response to that. There's a lot of literature in political science on transitions to democracy, and that's because of what Huntington called the third wave of democratization, which started in the mid-1970s in Southern Europe, and many think roughly ended with Indonesia in 1996. And that has spawned a lot of academics love to create terms. And there are dozens and dozens of them out there to try to describe different types of democracies. And I think what it means is what you're trying to suggest is that there are indeed varieties of democracy. Some are more parliamentary, some are more centralized, some are more presidential, some are more decentralized, some are partial, some are complete. The Russians actually have a name for their own democracy. They call it managed democracy. And 6 or 7 years ago, I'm not sure when, I might have accepted an argument there was some substance to that. Now I will accept that it's managed, but I won't accept that it's democratic.
Well, the only thing I could add to that is that in many cases, in many of these republics where there are retreats from the initial 1990s declarations for a democracy in these republics, but even then, but certainly now in Russia and in other republics, we hear the following. There are different kinds of democracies. It is not necessary that we adopt yours. But what you often have behind that is really limited democracy. Whatever else you call it, democracy has some basic principles. It has a number of different ways you can institute it, but some basic principles, including the diversification of political parties, freedom of information through all means. If you don't have these, then it is limited democracy. It may not be totalitarian, it may not be a dictatorship, but it's very limited democracy. But it's always turned into a national issue or an issue of national culture. That is, we Russians don't need you to teach us and give us democracy. We will find our own way, and that may take 20 years, and that may take a different form. Or there are Armenian leaders and Georgians and Azerbaijanis who will say that, and certainly Central Asians who've said it in the name of a dictatorship.